We joined here around 2018, have always loved being part of this community, and of course our move took us to where we can't be here weekly. Just for fun, I wanted to let you know that I learned at my grandmother's funeral about 20 years ago that I'm a 13th generation Presbyterian. Not so with Brian. We've been married 12 years. But it's fun to be here. And even my childhood church was called Community Presbyterian Church in Clarendon Hills, Illinois. Super thankful for that. My favorite story when I was a child, and the one that really stood out to me, is in the book of Luke, where, you know, there's the man on the stretcher who's lame, and his friends crawl up on the roof, open up a thing, drop their friend down in front of Jesus because, you know, the Pharisees were standing in the way. That for me has always been a picture of what it means to love your neighbor. And then as my faith really came to life in my early adult life, really that fervor for how do you get people to Jesus just really continued to strengthen in me. So just to give you a brief history of me and the ministry that God has let me be part of. Hopefully this is going the right way. As a 21-year-old, I accepted an invitation to go to Eastern Europe as a missionary. So I graduated from college in 1985. 3 months later, I got on a plane to Soviet Poland. Those were the Soviet days. And there's a little bit of where I think the concept of love your neighbor, and we're going to be looking today at the obstacles to loving your neighbor. I really think that developed for me in a situation where I was representing Jesus in a place where the governing authorities did not like that representation of Jesus. And so to work through the disinformation, the bad opinions, the stuff that gets hurled at us was always a part of how I needed to live out my Christian life. So just to summarize real quick, the thing that got me into Europe to stay, I ministered in Europe, Eastern Europe, for a span of 20 years, and I lived there for 16. But the thing that really catalyzed me in this 21-year-old time frame when I was in Eastern Europe going up to students, what we would do is we'd say, what's your opinion of Jesus Christ? And it was always awesome because they always had an opinion. They were educated and they had something to say about every topic. And I visited Belgrade, Yugoslavia in the middle of my year. I lived in Poland, but I visited Yugoslavia. And I met this young man who turns out he was in his last year of the university. He told us all he's a Bosnian prince. Very proud. And, you know, when I had that moment with him to say, what's your opinion of Jesus Christ? He said, who is Jesus? And at first I thought he was toying with me, like quoting, you know, Pontius Pilate. But then as I talked with him, I realized he was really looking at me like, who is Jesus? And he goes, is he one of those Greek gods? And that really started an avalanche for me to look at the world from the perspective of who does not have access to know the name of Jesus. I laid in bed for several nights after that. That was around April of that year. And I was like, I counted all the ways in my community that I could know about Jesus. And I was like, I have to be where people don't have this kind of access. And that led me to those 20 years of working in Eastern Europe. In 2007, I moved back to Central Florida. I moved to Central Florida as my father's health needed my attention, and I walked him through the end of his life, which was very much a privilege. But in the time frame of moving to the U.S., what I was able to do was take on supervisory roles in different mission agencies. So I still work with missionaries. I coach missionaries. I like to say that the city in which I live is called Zoom. And on a weekly basis, I go to Indonesia and India and a whole bunch of places that I may not choose to name as I work with missionaries overseas and help them do the things that God's called them to do. And that's what Community Pres has been supporting me to do. So thank you for that. Let's see how well I can dig into our topic today. Here we go. The coaching practice, I've got the name Courageous Conversations. And probably through today, you're going to figure out how that name Courageous Conversations came about. And I'm under the umbrella of Reliant Mission. Let us start. One of the gentlemen that I am coaching lives and works in India. And I want you to see this video that he produced for his ministry. It's about the caste system in India.
Turn back the pages of Mother India's story, and you'll find kings and monarchs, empires and dynasties that each rose and fell. For centuries, the face of India has been changing, but if you look beneath the surface, the one force that has endured the ages, whose grip has not been loosed, is that of caste. Caste is a millennia-old system that divides the people of India into a hierarchy that defines their human value at birth. The top three groups of the caste system make up less than 10% of the population and hold all spiritual, political, and economic power. This 10% has created a system of religion known by the world as Hinduism that relegates the remainder of the country to social, spiritual slavery. You cannot change your caste. And the philosophy of reincarnation says if you are faithful to your caste until death, you move up 1/1,000,000th of a life cycle in your next life. This diabolical ideology dictates poverty by destiny. Caste removes the possibility of freedom to choose. However, we think it's possible that truth can be the basis for turning this system on its head. The truth brought to the world by a man named Jesus, who said that all are created equal no matter what. What's amazing about the people of India? They are already looking for this truth. They are seeking a truth that can defy the cultural momentum that caste carries. Jesus is that truth. We are breaking caste barriers by drinking their chai, sitting in their homes, and washing the feet of these truth seekers. We're pointing them down a road to a man who speaks dignity and worth to people like no one ever has. We love and serve India by inviting these truth seekers to become truth keepers and develop a more intimate relationship with Jesus. That relationship transforms them to convey the freedom of the gospel to their own communities. They dissolve caste barriers through ordinary, radical acts, such as sitting down to a meal with anyone regardless of caste distinction. They become leaders who affect change right where they are by moving in humility and forgiveness and leading their own caste to wash the feet of their former enemies. In a country full of food and water shortages, sex trafficking, human trafficking, rape, and hundreds of millions of gods, this is our strategy. We as a ministry are called to the dirty and gritty task of not just pruning these issues back, but by pulling up these weeds by their roots. It's a calling that requires working with people, one at a time, to shift perspectives, to point to Jesus, to let Him light Indians' hearts on fire, and release them to return to their communities to build God's kingdom. We are Truth Seekers International, standing for love, equality, freedom, and dignity in India.
Alrighty. I might need some help getting back to my slideshow, Bill.
Bottom right corner.
Bottom right.
Click that right there.
Excellent.
And just minimize it.
Okay, and then here's my slideshow. Make it big.
This
Yes.
square at the top right. The square.
You're gonna make it big?
Right there.
There we go. Okay. So, isn't that an amazing ministry? To wash the feet of people who've been told they're untouchable. What's not in this video is this gentleman, his name is Grant, whom I coach, and he is taking on new leadership because they're sending Indians to lead this journey of going into villages. Every time they go into these villages, shortly after they're able to start gathering worshipers, which we would say is the beginning, the first stages of a church plant in these villages. So it's being very effective. And now he's starting to send more and more Indians to lead this rather than it being a foreign. It was actually started by an Indian gentleman in India. And Truth Seekers is a part of the Reliant umbrella, which is the mission agency that I've worked with for the last 8 years. My journey into loving my neighbor, I'm just going to say, I kind of thought I loved everybody. I was born in the 60s, or raised in the 60s. We really cared about loving the outsider. I think Presbyterian influence made us really interrogate ourselves and make sure our hearts were open. So one of the things that I think we have to wrestle with on this process of loving our neighbor is identify what are the obstacles that keep us. And as I prepared this, and I really felt like God put it on my heart to share these particular obstacles. It was actually back in the summer when I was praying about the presentation today. And the first obstacle I find is the need to start to be aware of when am I not experiencing someone as a neighbor? All right, we're going to get this here one of these days. Or else maybe I'm going to give this to somebody and just say, Bill, advance it. There we go. None of us wants to admit that we feel hatred because we know it's wrong. Yet we need to increase our awareness of the factors that erode our ability to love. So let's go ahead and advance it one more. I'm going to tell you a day in the late 90s when this became very apparent for me. So I lived in Albania. I started living in Albania in 1992. You might know that the Balkan Wars started the same year I lived there. And Albania, the ethnic group, Albanian people, are the majority group in a small region called Kosovo in the region of Yugoslavia. So in 1998 or so, exactly 1998, the Serbs started shelling the Albanian cities. And one of the projects that the churches did in Albania was we sent ourselves, I was fluent in Albanian at that time, we and those disciples that were raising up to be leaders in the churches, we went to the border zone where people were fleeing the shelling that the Serbs had, and we were helping the relief projects. You want to advance it? It's all good. I've just got a story to tell. So you can imagine, or let me explain to you that part of what we did was we interviewed the fleeing refugees, and we were helping the relief agencies to know what the needs were. But every one of these refugees would tell us their story. And unfortunately, the work that the Serbs did was psychological, personal, and individual. So for instance, one of the early sets of families that I interviewed, they ran from their house as they started to hear noise and shelling. But before they had gotten there, the soldiers had planted a car bomb in their little car, their little Yugo. And of course, they put their grandmother inside of it and people who have trouble walking. But of course, as they started the vehicle, you know what happened. And this is just one of story after story we heard where I knew that the work done was not this generalized, let's put a bomb in a city, but there was very personal, very psychological, very terrorizing action against the people that they were trying to get out of the region. A few weeks later that summer, I was in Vienna. And Vienna, Austria is a place where a lot of people go from a lot of places. Hi, good to see you.
A little late.
You're good.
Glad to be here.
You're good. And it was an evening, I put myself on a tram. I'd been wandering around. It was actually kind of a time to refresh from all the stories that I heard, get myself grounded. If you know anyone that hears these stories, they need extra time to process because we carry the stories that we've heard. But I got on this tram. And I didn't mention this, but one of my realities in Europe is I've studied most of the languages. So I was fluent in Serbo-Croatian, I was fluent in Serbian, I was fluent in Albanian. I was conversant in those. I was fluent in Albanian. And as I got on the tram, all of a sudden some young men got on. And it was kind of a deserted suburban area. It was dark. 3 or 4 young men, and they are very loudly speaking Serbian. And I was very aware, not only did I freeze, because guess what? I knew that if they knew I was American or if they knew I spoke Albanian, they would maybe be incited to do something against me. That I was also mad as hell. I was like, how dare you get on this bus and act all proud? And they were just loud. They owned the place. You know how it is. Americans were kind of like that ourselves. What that started to teach me, because I did feel the need to sit still and not let people know who I was or what I was. I was not going to say I'm a missionary. I'm used to, you can tell, I'm used to just walking up to people in Eastern Europe, say, hi, who are you? What's your opinion of Jesus? That was not going to be the conversation of that night. But that experience awakened in me the reality that I was mad at them just because of what language they spoke and who they were. And then I had to start to wrestle as a Christian with how do I deal with the fact that that is hatred. That was hatred. I wanted them gone. I wanted them silenced. I wanted them out of the way. I loved this other group of people called Albanian people. I want to help us understand how prevalent experiences like that are. Let's see, can we advance?
Other finger.
Other finger. All right. There's a subtle slide that causes us to erode in our love, and that is starts with the trigger of anxiety toward an individual or a group of people. And I know that we all feel that. It's a good place to add. I'm in seminary working on my master's, hoping to start my doctorate in the next year. And one of the facts that we wrestle with in seminary is how in the mid-'80s, our political leaders chose to use fear to chase us into the action that they wanted us. And that is just an American reality that in our society, certain people that we lean on, that lead us, want us to be fearful in order to get us to act. So I'm gonna spend a minute with a slide looking at what is our response to perceived threat, whether it's real or perceived. Like I think about that tram situation. You could say, well, was it real? Was it perceived? Well, I made sure it didn't become a threat, but I felt it. And what happens when we experience something that feels like threat, and many of you might know this, especially if you're in the medical field, we experience the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, that's your fight, flight, fright response. And this is an on or off switch. And the biblical descriptions of this are alarm, fear, worry, and anxiety. This is a very biblically acknowledged process. But I love what some of these pictures show, because what happens when that is stimulated in us, when we start to feel threatened, our eye pupils constrict, our brain constricts, the flow of saliva increases, our breathing constricts, and our heartbeat increases. We start to have a cessation of things that relate to our endocrine system, our bladder system, our digestive system. So very physically, our bodies prepare for fight, flight, fright, or freeze. And one of the things I think is really important to acknowledge is that this is a physiological response. I'm the kind of person in life that people have come along and said, they've treated it like it's an emotion. Calm down, don't worry. Because I perceive threat a lot of times before another person does. And many times people around me treat it as an emotion when in fact my body turned on. Looks like you've got some experience with this. And so part of what I feel like we need to do in our society is be very clear that part of our obstacle to loving our neighbor is this physiological, natural, God-given response. And we need to account for the fact that that is going to start to block us. Because when these physiological responses happen, also our prefrontal cortex goes offline. We turn into a very black and white responding person. Our brain narrows, and we're looking at what's the threat and what's our safety. So we can't expand our heart. We can't expand our thinking and generosity. We're in self-preservation. Does that make sense? You're probably with me on this. You've probably already thought about these things. But one of the things I think is important as we seek to increase our love or be able to love our neighbor is to continue to reflect on how much in our lives trigger the sympathetic nervous system. I just heard a ding. Did you hear it? No offense if that's your phone. Don't worry. No, this was not to point you out or make you feel bad. I apologize. But the fact is, we're in a situation in our society where constantly we have these dings. I've already mentioned we have political leaders. We have media who are like, they're out to make us afraid. Because we're Orlando people, I like to pick on a certain Christian radio station that's safe for the little ears, But man, when there's weather happening, we are stressed out, right? Everyone knows the way to keep you listening is to play into what you're afraid of. So I just want to account for that. I don't know how we could possibly change all that. But I want to comment about how we move from the activation of the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic, which is shalom. Shalom is the state of peace. Shalom is the state of safety. Shalom is the state of flourishing, and it's the opposite of feeling that we're under threat. All these things go back online as they need to. And let me just ask you guys, because I think more people than me in this room are aware of this move to activated nervous system and then coming back. How do you come back to a state of shalom?
Take a deep breath.
Wonderful. Beautiful first step. What else?
Show myself something else.
Focus on something else.
Pray.
Pray. Love it. Love it. I don't have anything to add to that. You guys are smarter than me on these fronts. But one of the things I want you to connect to this is that when God encountered people in the Bible, whether it was Mary, whether it was the shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth, you know, the angels always came and said, "Fear not, we bring you good news." So it was very important to God when he would go outside of natural order and actually encounter people that he made sure that they felt safety. And I just want you to add that to your picture of loving people. God always, when he comes to humanity, he says, "Fear not, I'm bringing you good news. I have love for you. My face delights in you." This is the way that God comes to us. He does not come to us with anxiety. And I love that. Did you know that Yahweh is actually a breathing word? And it goes like this, Yahweh. So when Moses encountered this crazy burning bush, and God says, "I am that I am, Yahweh that I am, Yahweh, Yahweh." So I know someone mentioned the word yoga earlier before we got started. I just want you to know this is Hebrew to breathe. Yahweh. And I believe God was very particular in making his name such that we would, with his name, enter shalom. Call on the name of God, and you will find peace. Yahweh. So one of the ministries that shaped me, Campus Crusade for Christ, when we talked about the spiritual life, we talked about spiritual breathing, this inhaling and exhaling, so that we were continuously full in the Spirit, or if something came along to knock us off of that fullness, we would... I just want to add, you probably have connected this dot, but when God created humanity, the difference with humans to animals, one of the differences, God spoke animals into being. When it came time to create humanity, he brought him out of the clay, breathed into him. So when Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," I think Descartes didn't have the picture, because I think what's more accurate, I breathe, therefore I am. So if you find yourself in a moment of stress, it's very biblical, very Hebrew. Go back to Yahweh. How are we doing? So inhabiting shalom, a couple of thoughts that I wanted to give to you was, number one, acknowledge how much around you is inviting you away from shalom. Actively extend time in shalom in your personal life by breathing, focusing on God, being rested, and creative. We talk about how just one day of Sabbath is not enough. We were active at my seminary. We talk about how much space do we need so that we actually are living cool, calm, collected, and creative. And I just want to invite you to deepen that lifestyle. How much of your day do you need to carve away? That electronics is off, interruptions is off, so that you actually have space. Even if you're not actively worshiping, if you just actually get your body into parasympathetic activation, that makes you more creative for the work that God brings in front of you. So that's big thought number one. The next thought I want to bring to you is the idea of needing to protect something. I believe that the need to protect things is something else that keeps us, our response to that protection keeps us from loving others. And it indicates that our view of ourselves has moved past being steward to being owner. And one of the questions I will ask of that is, who told you it was yours? That's something that God brought into the garden when Adam and Eve ate the apple. He said, who told you that you couldn't be like God? Who told you? So here's my next big story. I've got a blank screen. because I don't have pictures for it, but I want to take you to the spring of 1993 in Albania. And I had been there about 8 months. One of the things that we were finally being able to do is I was able to get out and run, do my exercise. I went into the local park, very big park. And as I'm running along the path, an Albanian gentleman on a bicycle starts to come past me, very close. He does this 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. You can imagine my heart is starting to race because I'm like, he wants to mess with me. And I'm like, what in the world do I do? Now, I want to insert now something that happened 2 weeks prior to that. And I want you to know that when I went as a missionary into Albania, I knew that I was going to a Muslim territory. So I actually thought, what do they do to missionaries in Muslim territories? I need to be ready for the fact that I could be raped. I got a bunch of vaccines that for diseases you might get if you're raped. I kind of did some funny things, in my opinion. And in my mind, I was prepared for an encounter, but not that I went looking for that encounter. Now, insert 2 weeks before this day in the park, I show up at our little Christian gathering. At that time, we were working with students. There was an orphanage across the street from Student City, and that's where our church met. And the guy who was leading the service that week put up a big sign, "What will you give to God?" And I walked in and I was like, well, this is interesting. I guess he's going to introduce the idea of tithing, me and my American brain. And I was like, God, what do you want me to give to you? And I want you to know from the second I saw the sign, the thought that came to my mind in terms of what I could give to God was to give him my virginity. Now, I don't know if you remember being a teenager, but when your parents ask you something weird, it's like, why are you asking me that? No. I mean, I spent the entire church service saying, God, you are weird and you need to come up with something else that I'm going to give you. And through that 45 minutes, well, it was an hour and a half, I'm sure, I could not think of anything else. And finally I was like, okay, God, here's what I have to give you. I give you my virginity. That was 2 weeks before the day I'm in a park when a young man starts doing this. And my solution was, I know if I go over the hill, there's more people, there's more population. So I'm like, and I'm running and he's on a bike, I'm going to go up the hill. I didn't account for the fact that he dropped the bike and run after me, And at one point, my brain was crazy at that point. At one point, I just was like, turn around and face him, this little voice in my head, which I did. And in that moment when I turned around and faced him, do you know what came into my mind and my heart as I looked at that young man? I was like, it will go so badly for you if you take what is God's. Because my virginity was God's. And what I was able to say out loud to him was, in the name of Jesus, you will not do this thing. Now, I spoke in English. I know he didn't understand it. And finally, it progresses minute by minute, and I was like, what do you want? And he grabs my arm, and finally I have Albanian words, because my mind was all cluttered as it is when we're under stress. And I was like, in Albanian, I was able to say, I don't know this boy and he wants to hurt me. I just yelled it out. Well, heads popped up, because it was lookout point and I didn't know it. And people got up, he ran away, But I want you to know that I remember in that moment what I thought about with this young man was, it's going to go badly for you if you take this thing because it belongs to God. And that, I think, unlocks something for us. Because by nature, I do believe that we are self-protective. Sorry, we're not on Meet Don yet. I don't know if we can go backwards. What I want to suggest is, okay, make it go backwards. You're better at this than me. What I would like to ask you to think about is this reality that if you feel that something is yours and you need to protect it, in what way will your self-protection keep you from being open to loving another person? And I would like to suggest to you, as God showed me before I met this would-be rapist in the park, that our task is to give to God everything. The question I put on the screen was, who told you? Who told you it's yours? Because in reality, we know biblically everything belongs to the Lord. We are stewards. And if you're aware that you need to protect something of your belongings, something of your person, I want to invite you, give it to God. Give up your need to protect it and come back to the place where, hey, I'm a steward. I do that with my house. I do that with my car. I did that, years ago when I'd have to drive through the bad parts of town to go to the university where I had to minister. That's your first step. I could say more, but time won't permit. I'm going to introduce you now to someone else who has struck fear in my heart, and I'm just going to describe him. We moved a couple of years ago to Indian River Drive in just north of Cocoa in Brevard County. And what I love on that drive, if you've never been there, by the way, it's beautiful. It's this lazy drive along the river, and the speed limit's 25, and people walk and bike and all this. I love it. I made sure that regularly in my week I have to drive up the river to where I work out and teach yoga, and because I just want that as a part of my day. Well, here, come along. I swear 3 times every week that I needed to make that drive, I would come up along a truck that was going about 10 miles an hour. Now, if y'all know me, I'm kind of a go-getter. I don't ever leave myself enough margin to just drive 10 miles an hour to get to where I need to go. I'm just not like that way. And this particular truck, without identifying what, this particular truck had a lot of paraphernalia with a particular political persuasion. And it's a political persuasion that flat out scares me. So about a year of this, 3 times a week, I'm behind this red truck. And I would be like, get out of the way. No, I hate you, all this stuff. I was not loving my red truck neighbor. Okay, you got that picture clearly. At the beginning of this calendar year, I was with some of the students that I coach, some of the staff members, missionaries that I coach. And they said, hey, for the start of the year, here's a little prayer we're going to do. You're going to ask God what God wants you to pay attention to this year. I was in Indonesia at a conference. And I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but I was like, oh, that's a nice prayer for all the young people. God won't have anything for me. But anyway, I closed my eyes, and I'm not kidding you guys, but I want you to enjoy the story. I closed my eyes, and what instantly comes in my view? You know it. So a couple weeks after that, I'm at my seminary, and this professor, Dr. Stubbs, is doing one of our chapels, and he says, by the way, when I saw the red truck, I just want you to know I threw down my pen and I cursed at God. I said, damn it, God, excuse me. And I don't mean to put bad language in anybody's mind, but that's how mad I was that I might have to go to this guy. But I did actually go, okay, this is what God wants. So a couple weeks later at my seminary, I get the tool. He says the way that we reach out to consider our enemies, we expand our imagination such that at our table, we invite them to sit down at our table and have a meal with us. And I was like, whoa, that's really scary. And I knew God was saying, this is what you need to do with red truck driver, right? I shared it with my Abbey group. They all started praying. We all started talking about red truck guy with the scary political paraphernalia. I prayed for him from January until April 28th. And on that day, I finally, from all the weeks that I could not see him, I didn't see him once in those 4 months, I want you to know. But I saw that he was driving down the road, and it was a moment, and I was like, this is my moment to go talk to him. And I'd pre-decided if I ever could grab him or wave him down, I'm going to say, tell me the story of your flags, because that's what scared me, his political paraphernalia. And anyway, I did. I met him. His name is Don. And I want you to know, we'd been praying for him for 4 months. I shared about him with some other people. And I introduced myself because I was like, this has got to be weird to this guy. And in my head, it's like, Cori, this is about you cleansing your heart. This is not about changing this person. And so I said, he goes, my name's Don, and blah, blah. And I said, Don, tell me about your political paraphernalia. Tell me the story. And he puts his hands on his steering wheel, and he ducks his head. And he goes, I'm very patriotic, and I have done things that God would never forgive me for. Just let that sit for a minute. Regardless of his politics, all of a sudden I'm aware he feels a burden. And so it turns out he was a soldier in the Vietnam War in the early 70s. He committed atrocities in Asia. He says, we were taught to kill, and I was very good at it, and I enjoyed it. And, his thing with his paraphernalia is him trying to cleanse himself. And his vulnerability was really beautiful that day, but also as someone who's traumatized by their past, he couldn't go right there. It took us some time. I continue to pray because I don't know. I will tell you this, Don texts me periodically. I always stop and talk to him. But I'm in a place where this person who annoyed me, who represents something that I feel like is a threat to my life, God very particularly said, you're going to build a bridge with this person. And I feel very clear on the reality that he has half a healing. He has enough to know that it's wrong, but he doesn't have enough to know that Jesus wants to lift it. And I think all of us want to be in that place where we look beyond the externals that can make us afraid, and we love our neighbor and carry their burdens with them, help them relinquish their burdens. Thank you for meeting Don. I'm going to have pictures of him one day. So what led me to this was, how can I expand my imagination to include this person at my table? I skipped a slide that talks about name calling, because I think we all know that as soon as we say idiot, fool, whatever, we've murdered that person. That's what Jesus says. And so one of the realities we need to embrace as we seek to love people is to be honest about when we have a murderous spirit. I'm not going to go into that. I was raised in a name-calling home, so I can go there quite easily. Right, Brian? No, I don't name call him, but I'll name call drivers on the road a lot. Let me summarize. Few obstacles to remove so that we can love others as our neighbors. Reduce the amount of space that's given to perceived threat. You can do that actively. Breathe, walk in shalom. Find spaces in the day to do that. Give to God the things you're tempted to protect. Kind of the word that kind of connects to this, that idea of stand your ground. That's where I kind of want to go, is it our ground? Whose ground is it? Let's give to God the things we feel we need to protect. And practice the imagination of inviting people you fear to your table in your imagination. Start in your imagination. Maybe the Lord will open the door where you're actually sitting with them at your table. I'm going to trust with my friend Don, who has a political paraphernalia, that one day he's going to come into our house and sit at our table. But I'm really more interested that he's able to cast his burdens on the Lord. In Matthew 24, Jesus gives a picture of the end times, and I think that's active in our minds a lot. One of the descriptors that he gives, and I think it's in Matthew 24:4, is it says, the hearts of the people will grow cold. So in the face of these wars, rumors of wars, whatever, we all face that place where we could be those people whose hearts grow cold. And his solution in that's a few words away, and this is really well stated in the Revised Standard Version, is do not let your heart be alarmed. That's our responsibility. That's our call. And when God gives us the responsibility, he gives us the capacity to do it. So I just hope that this helps stimulate you to where you can breathe, release, keep yourself from being alarmed so that you can love your neighbor.